I put $5 into an online lottery ticket while my daughter slept down the hall, and I won $50. I laughed, took a screenshot, and started typing a text to celebrate. Then my phone buzzed with a different notification, a deposit into my checking account with 7 more zeros than it should have had. I called the bank in a panic, certain it was a glitch. The woman on the line went quiet for a long moment, and then she said 4 words that changed the rest of my life. "Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. People love to say that a single moment can rearrange an entire life. I used to nod along politely whenever I heard it, the way you nod at a fortune cookie, without really believing the paper inside applied to you. I was a chemistry teacher. I believed in measurable things, in reactions you could predict if you understood the variables. I did not believe in overnight miracles, and I certainly did not believe in phone calls that could split a life into a before and an after. Then, on a Thursday night in April, I learned exactly how wrong I had been. My name is Ava Whitlock. I was 44 years old, and I lived in a rented duplex on the south side of Denver, Colorado, in a neighborhood where the trains ran close enough that you learned to talk over them without noticing. I taught 11th grade chemistry at a public high school, the kind of job where you fall in love with your students in September and are utterly exhausted by them come May, and somehow love them anyway. I had a daughter, Nora, 15 years old, opinionated, allergic to nonsense, the brightest and most stubborn person I had ever met, and without question the best thing I had ever done with my life. I had a 10-year-old sedan with a check engine light that came on so often I'd stopped noticing it. And I had debt, not dramatic debt, just the patient, everyday kind that sits on your shoulders and never quite falls off. Credit cards from the 2 years after my divorce when the child support checks were unreliable. A car loan. Nora's orthodontist. Nora's everything, because that was simply what being her mother meant, and I never once resented a cent of it. My marriage to Daniel had not ended with shouting or betrayal, which people always assume makes it easier. It doesn't. It ended with 2 exhausted people sitting at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning, both of us finally admitting out loud what we had privately known for a year. He moved to Seattle for a job at a software company. I kept the duplex, the dog, and Nora, and I kept moving forward because that was the only direction available to me. That was my life before all of this happened. Small, tight, entirely mine, and I was in my own quiet way proud of it. Teaching had never made me wealthy, but it had made me useful, and for a long time that felt like enough. I coached the school's academic decathlon team in the spring, graded lab notebooks at my kitchen table long after Nora had gone to bed, and kept a drawer full of granola bars for the kids who came to class hungry, because I remembered exactly what that felt like. I had colleagues who treated the job as a stepping stone to something else. I never did. There was a particular satisfaction in watching a student who swore they were bad at science finally understand why a reaction balanced the way it did. And I built my entire sense of worth around moments like that, because they were the one part of my life that never once let me down. Money, in that life, was a constant quiet arithmetic running in the background of everything. Could I afford new brakes this month, or would the old ones hold until June? Could Nora go on the school trip to the aquarium, or would I need to ask the front office, quietly, about the hardship fund? I was not miserable. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy for someone hearing the story to assume I'd spend years drowning in unhappiness before the money arrived. I hadn't. I had a good, full, difficult life, but it was a life with very little room in it for anything unexpected, and unexpected things, as any parent knows, arrive constantly whether you have room for them or not. On the night everything changed, I was sitting on my couch grading lab reports in sweatpants, eating cereal straight from the box because I hadn't made it to the grocery store. Nora was upstairs on a video call with her friends, And the duplex had that particular Thursday night stillness that settles in once the dishes are done and the world outside has gone dark. On a whim, the same small whim that struck me maybe once a season, I opened an app for the Colorado online lottery and bought a single $5 ticket. I watched the little wheel spin. The screen lit up. I had won $50. I laughed out loud, genuinely delighted by something so small. $50 was gas money, a nice dinner, nothing life-altering, but it felt like a wink from the universe on an otherwise unremarkable evening. I was already composing a text to send Nora upstairs. Guess who's buying pizza this weekend? When my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from my bank. I almost ignored it. I opened it anyway. A deposit of $500 million has been posted to your account, ending in 2289. I read it 4 times. I set the phone down on the coffee table as if it might be contagious, then picked it back up and read it a 5th time. $500 million. 7 more zeros sitting there behind that same 50 I just won, as though someone had taken my little $5 joke and multiplied it into something monstrous and impossible. My first thought was a scam text. My second thought was a bank error, the kind you hear about that gets corrected within the hour and leaves you feeling foolish for having hoped at all. My third thought, the one I refused to let myself finish, arrived with a strange heat behind my ribs that I pushed down immediately because I was a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust good news before she had facts to back it up. I called the bank's 24-hour line. The automated system tried twice to redirect me to the fraud department's voicemail. I mashed 0 until a human being finally answered, a woman, calm, clearly reading from a script, who asked for my account number and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I gave them. I heard typing. Then silence, the particular silence of someone reading something on a screen that they are not quite sure how to say out loud. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, not to a whisper exactly, but low enough that I pressed the phone hard against my ear. She said 4 words. You need to come in. That was all. Then, at normal volume again, as if catching herself, Ms. Whitlock, we'd like you to visit our downtown branch first thing tomorrow morning. Please ask for the branch manager, Mr. Whitfield. She ended the call before I could ask a single question. I sat on that couch until well past midnight, the cereal box forgotten beside me, staring at the ceiling and thinking, for the first time in years, about my father. A man I hadn't spoken a real word to in 15 years. A man I had convinced myself I'd made peace with losing, and who I now found myself wondering about with an intensity that frightened me a little. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to the trains pass 2 blocks over, and memories I hadn't visited in a very long time began surfacing, slow and unbidden, the way silt rises when you disturb still water. My father, Walter Sinclair, had spent 40 years building himself up from nothing. A man who started with a single rundown duplex in Austin and turned it, through decades of stubborn, joyless work, into a modest real estate empire across central Texas. He was brilliant about property and impossible about almost everything else. We had a falling out when I was 29 over a decision he never forgave me for making with my own life, and after that, the silence between us calcified into something neither of us knew how to break. I remembered, that night, small useless details I hadn't thought of in years. The smell of the cedar-lined office where he kept his ledgers, the way he'd let me sit on the floor beside his desk as a child and stack his old blueprints into towers while he worked. I remember the sound of his voice on the one phone call we'd had after the falling out, clipped and final, and how I had told myself for 15 years that I was fine without it, that some silences simply become permanent and you learn to build a life around the empty space they leave. Lying there in the dark, I realized I had never once stopped listening for him, not really. I heard, secondhand, through his sister, my Aunt Renata, that his health had started failing in his late 60s. 6 years ago, she called to tell me he had died quietly in a hospital outside Austin. She told me the estate was complicated, tangled in debt from a few bad late-life investments, and that there wasn't much left to speak of. She told me not to worry about any of it. I believed her, because she was my aunt, because grief makes you trust the people standing closest to you, and because I had no reason then to think otherwise. The downtown branch of First Meridian Bank opened at 9. I was there at 8:40, wearing the one blazer I owned over clean jeans, carrying a folder with my ID, my bank statements, and a printed screenshot of the notification, as though evidence of what I had seen with my own eyes might somehow be required. Mr. Whitfield turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair. He shook my hand, led me into a private office, and closed the door with the careful, practiced gentleness of someone about to deliver news he had rehearsed on the drive-in. He explained it slowly, methodically, the way you'd explain a diagnosis. 9 days earlier, the probate court of Travis County, Texas, had issued a final distribution order for the estate of Walter James Sinclair. The estate, which included commercial real estate, a substantial investment portfolio, and liquid assets accumulated over 4 decades, had been tied up in probate proceedings for years. Under the terms of my father's original, notarized will, filed with the court 7 years before his death, the sole beneficiary of the entire estate was his only child, me. The funds were meant to route through an intermediary trust account before reaching a personal account. Due to what Mr. Whitfield delicately called a clerical failure in the wiring instructions submitted by the estate's custodian, the full distribution had bypassed the trust entirely and landed directly in my checking account. $540,000 and change. I sat perfectly still. I asked him to repeat the part about the will. He did. I asked why I had never once been told any of this existed. He looked at me with something close to pity and said that question belonged to an estate attorney, not a bank manager. I asked him what happened next, practically, mechanically, because I needed something concrete to hold on to. He explained that the bank had already flagged the account under a standard large transaction compliance review, and that the funds would remain accessible but closely monitored until the estate's originating custodian confirmed the distribution in writing. He slid a card across the desk with the name of a compliance officer, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said something that stayed with me the rest of that day. "Ms. Whitlock, whatever irregularity caused this to land in your personal account rather than the trust, it doesn't change whose money this legally is. It only changes how visible the mistake became." I didn't fully understand what he meant until much later. At the time, I simply nodded, thanked him, and walked back out into a Tuesday morning that looked exactly the same as every other Tuesday morning of my life and felt like nothing of the kind. I drove home in a fog. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I called my Aunt Renata. She picked up on the second ring, warm, immediately chatty, asking about Nora, about my classes, about the weather in Denver, the voice of a woman with absolutely nothing to hide. I'd asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether my father had left a will. There was a pause, small, but unmistakably real. "Ava, honey, we've talked about this. There wasn't much of an estate left by the end." "There was a will," I said. "It named me as the sole beneficiary. The probate court just released the funds." The second pause was longer, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had a different texture to it entirely, careful, composed, like a face rearranged behind a closing door. Ava, let's not do this over the phone. There's context you don't have. 6 years of silence, and she called it context. I got off the phone before I said something I couldn't unsay. I sat down on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and thought with a terrible clarity about what her hesitation meant, that she had known. That her son, my cousin Colin, who worked in wealth management down in Dallas, and whom I had always found a little too smooth for comfort, had almost certainly known too. That for 6 years, while I clipped grocery coupons and dreaded every unexpected car repair and lay awake calculating whether I could afford Nora's braces this year or next. There had been money. My money. My father's last word to me, and someone had been sitting on it. By the time Nora came downstairs that evening, I had already made a decision. I was going to find an attorney. I was going to get every document I was legally entitled to, and I was going to do it quietly before Renata or Colin had any idea I was moving. Whatever advantage they'd built over 6 years of silence, the only thing I had on my side was that they didn't yet know how much I'd figured out. I found Miriam Okafor through the Teachers Union's legal referral service, which offered members a free consultation before any billing began. I used mine on a Saturday morning, sitting in a small office that smelled of printer toner and old coffee, and within 15 minutes I understood that a free consultation was not going to be nearly enough. Miriam was in her early 60s, silver-braided hair, a probate litigation specialist with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 30 years being underestimated in rooms full of men in expensive suits and had learned to enjoy proving them wrong. When I finished laying out everything I knew, she leaned back and was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me again, word for word, what your aunt said when you asked about the will," she said. I repeated it. "There's context you don't have." Miriam nodded slowly. "That is not the sentence of a woman who's confused about the past. That's the sentence of a woman managing information." She asked me a series of quiet, practical questions after that. Whether I had copies of any correspondence from the estate, whether I'd ever received tax documents mentioning an inheritance, whether anyone in the family had ever mentioned my father's assets in passing. I hadn't. Not once, in 6 years, had anyone let slip so much as a hint. That, Miriam told me, was almost more telling than anything else. A genuine oversight tends to leak somewhere eventually, in a careless comment at a holiday dinner, in a slip of the tongue. 6 years of total, disciplined silence was not an oversight. It was maintenance. She took my case. I used a portion of the now legally frozen funds, released with written authorization from Mr. Whitfield once the situation was formally under review, to cover her retainer. Once she had a foothold, Miriam moved fast, requesting the original probate filing, the will itself, every piece of correspondence between the estate and the court, and the full financial records of the account that had supposedly been managing distributions on my behalf for the past 6 years. What she found, over the following 2 weeks, was a story far uglier than a simple oversight. My father had drafted his will 7 years before he died, plain and unambiguous. Everything to his daughter, Ava Marie Sinclair Whitlock. He had filed it properly with an Austin estate attorney named Harold Green. When my father passed, Green had submitted the will to the Travis County Probate Court exactly as required. The estate, commercial buildings, land, and investments my father had spent 4 decades quietly accumulating, was valued at just over $502 million at the time of his death. My aunt had immediately contested the will, on grounds Miriam described as legally thin, vague claims that my father hadn't been of sound mind in his final years. But buried deep in the probate file, in a filing submitted 5 years earlier, was a document I had never seen and never signed. A second, later amended will, dated just 2 months before my father's death, purportedly disinheriting me entirely and naming Renata as sole beneficiary, notarized by a man whose license, it turned out, had since been revoked for unrelated fraud. I had never signed any such document. I had never even been told my father was drafting a new one. Miriam sent the amended will to a forensic document examiner, a meticulous, soft-spoken analyst named Dr. Aaron Patel, who compared the signature page against verified samples of my father's handwriting from bank records, tax filings, and old birthday cards he'd sent me before we stopped speaking entirely. The results came back 9 days later. The signature page had been physically spliced, lifted from an older, unrelated document, and reattached to the new pages using a technique meant to defeat a casual glance, but not a forensic one under magnification. The paper stock on the signature page didn't even match the rest of the document. Someone had manufactured a fake while using a piece of my father's genuine signature, cut from something else entirely, to erase me from my own inheritance. Dr. Patel walked Miriam and me through the physical mechanics of it one evening in her conference room, laying enlarged photographs of the document across the table like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted solved. Under magnification, the paper fibers along the bottom edge of the signature page didn't align with the fibers of the page above it. The toner density was subtly different, the kind of inconsistency invisible to the eye but obvious to a machine built to measure exactly that. He explained that whoever assembled the document had likely photocopied a genuine signature from an older, unrelated paper my father had signed years earlier, trimmed it precisely, and reproduced it onto a freshly typed final page before running the whole thing through a laser printer to blend the ink. It was patient work. It was not the work of someone acting in a moment of panic. It was the work of someone who had planned carefully, who understood exactly what they were doing, and exactly how unlikely it was that anyone would ever look closely enough to notice. The day Miriam called with Dr. Patel's findings, I was standing in the school parking lot after the last bell, and I had to sit down on the curb because my legs simply stopped cooperating. I stared at the line of buses pulling out and thought about the word fabrication. It was a word I associated with courtroom dramas, not with my Aunt Renata, who had sent me a birthday card every single year without fail, who had taught me to bake bread on her porch in Austin the summer I was 11 and smelled permanently of vanilla and dish soap. Meanwhile, something else had started happening. 3 days after my phone call with Renata, my cousin Colin texted me for the first time in years. "Hey Ava, hope you and Nora are doing well. Been thinking about you guys. Mom mentioned you called." 2 days after that, a second message. "Seriously, let me know if you ever need anything. Family's family." Then a LinkedIn request. Colin managed portfolios for wealthy clients in Dallas. He knew how to read a financial tremor from 100 miles away. He and Renata had clearly spoken after my phone call, and whatever they'd heard in my voice had been enough to put them on alert. They were checking the temperature, feeling out how much I actually knew. Miriam told me exactly what this meant. We had a window, and it was closing fast. We needed to file before they had time to prepare a defense, or worse, before evidence started quietly disappearing. I thought about the spliced signature page, my father's real handwriting stolen and reused to erase his own daughter, and I told her to file. She filed the civil complaint on a Monday morning. By that afternoon, Colin had called my cell 4 times. I let every call go to voicemail. I was mid-lesson, walking the room while my students titrated acid into base, and I felt each buzz in my pocket with something close to satisfaction. Let him wait. After school, I sat in my car in the empty lot and listened to the voicemails in order. The first 3 were nearly identical. "Ava, we need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. Please call me back." The 4th was different. His voice had gone tight, stripped of its usual polish. "Ava, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop and really think before you go any further with this. There are things about Dad's, about Uncle Walter's situation you don't understand. Call me tonight." I deleted all 4 and drove home. He called twice more that night. Just before 9, the call stopped and a text arrived instead. "Meet me tomorrow. Somewhere neutral. We can settle this without lawyers." I showed it to Miriam, who told me flatly not to meet him anywhere without her present and without a recorder running. I didn't respond. 2 nights later, Colin called one final time, and against Miriam's advice I picked up, mostly because I wanted to hear, unfiltered, what he'd say now that he knew the complaint had been filed. He was quiet for a moment after I answered. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. "Have you thought about what this does to the family? To Mom. She's 68 years old. She filed a fabricated will with a probate court," I said. "That's not what happened. A forensic examiner says otherwise." Another silence, longer this time, and when he spoke again the smoothness had drained entirely out of his voice, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Nora applied for that Denver Metro Achievers scholarship last month, didn't she? $25,000 a year, renewable for 4 years. I happen to know the chair of that foundation board. We play golf twice a month. I didn't say anything. I'm just saying, Colin continued, there are a lot of moving parts in a situation like this. People who could be helpful. Or not, depending on how this goes. I'll see you in court, I said, and I hung up. My hands, oddly, were steady. I called Miriam immediately and documented the conversation while it was still fresh, and she confirmed that the veiled threat toward Nora's scholarship mattered a lot. 3 days later, Nora mentioned, in the offhand way teenagers mention things, that a black SUV had been parked across from our duplex for 2 evenings running. I noted the make and model and filed a report with the Denver police, not because I expected anything to come of it right away, but because I wanted a documented paper trail. Miriam noted it too, in case Renata and Colin were having me watched. I found myself glancing out the front window more often than I liked to admit over the following week, checking the street before letting Nora walk to the bus stop, and I hated that I had to think that way about anything connected to my own family. The SUV never reappeared after that first week, but I never stopped noticing its absence either, the way you keep listening for a sound long after it's actually stopped. It was Miriam who suggested I take a few days away before the case went any further. You're no good to yourself, burned out, she said. The next phase is going to demand everything you have. Take Nora somewhere. Disconnect. Come back ready. I listened. I rented a small cabin outside Estes Park, 2 hours into the mountains, surrounded by aspens just beginning to bud out after a long winter, with almost no cell signal at all. Nora thought it was a spontaneous adventure and spent the first day complaining loudly about the lack of Wi-Fi. By the second day, the mountain quiet had done its work, and she started talking, really talking, in a way she rarely did back in the noise of our ordinary life. We hiked. We cooked over the wood stove. We sat on the porch each evening and watched the light drain slowly out of the peaks, and she told me about a boy in her chemistry class she liked, about wanting to study environmental engineering, about 100 small hopes I hadn't known she was carrying. I listened to every word and thought, this is what I'm fighting for. Not only the money, her future, unencumbered, the life my father had apparently wanted to hand us both, stolen and sat on for 6 years while we scraped by without it. On the third afternoon, we hiked up to a small overlook above the cabin, and Nora, out of breath and pink-cheeked from the climb, turned to me and asked, half joking, whether we were rich now. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't actually know yet, that the money existed but wasn't really ours until a court said so, and that either way it didn't change who we were or how we treated people. She rolled her eyes at me the way only a 15-year-old can and said, "That's such a mom answer." And then she took my hand anyway, and we stood there for a long while looking out over the valley, not talking, just breathing the thin mountain air together. On our last evening there, after Nora had gone inside, I sat alone on the porch under a sky so clear it looked engineered. I breathed in the cold mountain air and felt myself settle the way a bridge settles once the wind dies down. Not rigid, but steady. I was ready to go back. We drove home on a Sunday, and by Monday morning I was back in my classroom, back in the rhythm of Bunsen burners and pop quizzes, grateful in a way I hadn't expected for the sheer ordinariness of the work. There is something grounding about a room full of teenagers worried about their grades. It reorders your sense of what actually matters. The call from Renata came on a Wednesday evening while I was doing dishes. Her name lit up my screen exactly the way it had my entire life, and it looked different now. I dried my hands and answered. She opened with small talk, my health, the weather, a vague comment about spring in Texas. Then, "Ava, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know you're upset, and I understand why. But I want you to consider something." A pause, the sound of rehearsed words being carefully unpacked. Colin and I are willing to offer a resolution. We've spoken with our attorneys. We can put together $20 million for you. A clean settlement. No trial, no depositions, no dragging the family through any of this. $20 million. 10 years earlier, that number would have lit something desperate in my chest. It would clear every debt I'd ever carried. Buy Nora's entire college education twice over, let me stop doing math in the grocery aisle for the rest of my natural life. It was, by any measure I had ever applied to my own existence, an obscene sum of money. But it was not $500 million. It was not what my father had actually put my name on, before someone stole a piece of his signature and pasted it onto a lie. No, I said. Renata's tone shifted, the warmth thinning into something harder underneath. Ava, be practical. Litigation is expensive and exhausting, and you don't know everything you'll find once this really goes to court. Your father had a complicated life in his final years. There are things. I have a forensic examiner's report proving the second will was fabricated, I said quietly. I have an attorney who knows probate law better than anyone your money can buy, and I have all the time in the world. Goodbye, Renata. There was one more thing, she said before I could hang up, quiet and almost pleading, so different from the composed woman who had opened the call. Your father loved you, Ava. Whatever you think of me right now, please believe that. I stood there with the phone against my ear for a moment, dish towel still in my other hand, and I found I couldn't answer her. Not because I doubted it, but because I didn't yet know what to do with the fact that it might be true, and that she had still done what she'd done anyway. I hung up without saying anything else. I ended the call, set the phone on the counter, and finished the dishes. Was I certain, in that moment, that I would win? No. I felt the specific, clarifying fear of someone standing at the edge of something enormous, looking down. 20 million and a clean exit, or 500 million and a fight I had no guarantee of winning. But I also understood something else, something that had been hardening in me since the night I sat on my kitchen floor. If I took the 20 million, I would spend the rest of my life knowing exactly what I had let them get away with. I would not be able to live inside that knowledge. I would rather lose everything fighting than win a smaller, quieter defeat. Later that week I told 2 people the entire truth. The first was Yolanda Reyes, a colleague from school who had spent 15 years as a court reporter before she started teaching, and who listened to the whole story at my kitchen table without interrupting once, then took off her glasses and said, Ava, this is airtight. Do not you dare settle. The second was my downstairs neighbor, Priya Chandra, who had become something like a second aunt to Nora over the years, and who reacted to the number, 500 million, the fabrication, all of it, with a steadiness that made me feel, for the first time since it began, that I wasn't carrying it alone. What do you need from me? She asked. I need someone outside of all this to just know. I told her. She nodded. Then I know, she said. That's enough. Nora still didn't know the full shape of it yet. I'd kept it vague, a legal matter about your grandfather's estate, and she'd accepted that with the incurious trust of a teenager who has enough of her own life to carry. I hated keeping even that much from her, but I told myself it was temporary, that she deserved a childhood that wasn't shaped around a courtroom battle she was too young to fully carry, and that I would tell her everything the moment there was something solid enough to tell. They came to Denver on a Saturday. I didn't know they were in the city until the buzzer sounded from the street door at 2 in the afternoon. Colin's voice came through the intercom, easy and light. Hey, Ava, it's us. We flew in. Can we come up? I stood there with my hand against the wall for a long moment. The careful part of me, the part Miriam had trained, said to send them straight to her office. The other part of me, the part that still remembered a porch smelling of vanilla, buzzed them up. They arrived with a bouquet of white lilies, absurdly cheerful against everything else in the room. Colin wore a pressed shirt and the same practiced smile he'd had on the phone. Renata looked smaller than I remembered, her hair fully silver now, and something in my chest moved unexpectedly at the sight of her. She had my father's eyes exactly, the same pale gray, and for one unguarded half-second standing there in my doorway I felt 15 years fall away entirely. I let them in. I did not offer coffee. We sat, me in the armchair, them on the couch, my phone on the coffee table between us with the recording app quietly running, Colorado being a state where only one party needs to consent, a fact Miriam had made sure I knew cold. For the first 10 minutes, it was almost convincing. Renata asked about Nora, about my classes. Colin complimented the duplex in a way that somehow managed to also diminish it. Then Renata leaned forward, her voice taking on a practiced, wounded softness. Ava, I want you to hear this from me in person. Your father and I were close those last years. You weren't there. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I understand why. But someone had to be, and it was me. I held his hand while he was dying. He was confused near the end. He changed his mind about things constantly. He thought you wanted nothing to do with him. He had a will-drafted 7 years before he died. I said. Dr. Patel's report. Experts can be wrong. Colin cut in smoothly. Experts can also be hired to say exactly what their client needs them to say. You understand that, right? Whatever your attorneys told you, she has a financial interest in you pursuing this. As do you, I said, in me not pursuing it. Colin's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes tightened. Ava, we're your family. We're the only family you have left. Do you really want years of litigation? Do you want Nora watching her mother live in a courtroom because that's exactly what you're choosing right now? Someone spliced my father's signature onto a document he never wrote, I said. That's what I'm choosing to fight. Nobody fabricated anything, Renata said, and her voice had shifted now, the softness thinning into something more brittle. You're confused, Ava. There it was, that precise, surgical word, confused, designed to land somewhere uncertain inside me, to make me doubt the very ground I was standing on. I recognized the tactic instantly, because I had watched students use versions of it on each other for years, the calm insistence that someone else's clear memory couldn't possibly be trusted. I was not confused. I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I'd like you both to leave now, I said. Colin stood first, straightening his shirt, and offered a thin, careful smile. You're going to regret this, Ava. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm saying it as someone who's watched this exact kind of case play out before. It takes years. It costs a fortune. And when it's finally over, you'll have hurt people who loved you, and the outcome won't be what you're hoping for. Renata gathered her purse. At the door, she turned and looked at me one last time, and for a single unguarded second I saw something cross her face that wasn't quite remorse but was close to recognition. She knew that I knew. She knew what I could prove. She opened her mouth, as if she might say one more thing, some final appeal, and then seemed to think better of it, and simply left the white lilies sitting on my coffee table as she walked out, as though the flowers alone might still argue her case after she was gone. I threw them away that night without a second thought. They left. I pressed both palms flat against the cool wall of my hallway and breathed, hands shaking, not only from fear, though the fear was real, because Colin was right that litigation was expensive and long and uncertain, and I did not have unlimited resources against people who apparently did. But underneath the fear, something else had caught fire, because they had flown to Denver in person. They had bought white lilies and pressed a shirt. That meant they were afraid too. I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and called Miriam. They came in person, I said. I have all of it. A pause. Then Miriam said simply, Good. Send it to me tonight. The trial began on a gray morning in October, 6 months after Miriam first filed the complaint. I remember the light specifically, because Denver in October has that flat, serious quality to it that makes everything feel heavier than usual. I parked 2 blocks from the courthouse, carrying a leather folder and a coffee I never actually drank. Miriam met me in the corridor outside the courtroom, exactly as composed as always, buried in an unreasonable amount of organized paper. Renata and Colin were already seated at the opposing table when I walked in. Renata wore a dark suit, her hands folded with a stillness that looked rehearsed. Colin, in charcoal, looked like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. He held my gaze for one deliberate second, then looked away. I sat beside Miriam and did not look at either of them again. The judge, the Honorable Elaine Marsh, was a woman in her early 60s with the particular stillness of someone who had heard every kind of human story imaginable and cared only about the facts underneath them, which I found immediately reassuring. Miriam's opening statement was clean and unemotional. She laid out a timeline, the original will, its proper filing, the estate's value, the fabricated second document, the wiring error that had accidentally exposed everything. 6 years of silence. She built the picture piece by piece, the way you'd assemble evidence on a table, until it simply couldn't be argued with. Dr. Patel testified on the second day, calm and exact, walking the jury through the splice in the signature page, the mismatched paper stock, the revoked notary, whose stamp had appeared on at least 2 other disputed documents in Travis County over the same 18-month window. In my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, he said. The signature page on Exhibit 12 did not originate with the rest of the document. Opposing counsel cross-examined him for nearly 2 hours. He did not waver once. A forensic accountant, Miriam, had retained walked the jury through 6 years of financial records, the sale of commercial properties, the liquidation of investment accounts, and most damning of all, nearly $19 million in administrative and management fees that had quietly flowed from the estate into accounts controlled by Renata and Colin over that same period. He broke the numbers down year by year on a large screen, and the pattern was impossible to miss once it was laid out that plainly. The fees had increased steadily each year, always just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic audit under the terms of the original trust documents, as though whoever set them had studied exactly where that line sat and made sure never to cross it. I watched a juror in the second row, a retired firefighter according to Miriam's jury selection notes, underline something twice on his legal pad and glance over at Colin with an expression that told me exactly what he now thought of him. Then Renata took the stand. She was composed at first, guided through a rehearsed, sympathetic narrative by her attorney, the devoted sister, the faithful caretaker managing an impossibly complicated estate. She explained the fees as fair compensation for years of difficult work. She claimed my father had personally told her, in a phone call she said we'd had, that he wanted the will changed. Miriam's cross-examination began gently. She asked Renata to describe that phone call in detail, the date, the approximate time. Renata described it. Then Miriam introduced Exhibit 19. 6 years of my father's phone records. No such call existed on the date Renata had given, nor on either day surrounding it. Renata said perhaps she'd misremembered the date. Miriam offered her every phone record from that entire final year. Nothing matched. Renata suggested it might have been an email instead. Miriam introduced the full electronic discovery record, compelled from Renata and Colin's own devices months earlier. There was no email about annual change. There was, however, an email exchange between Renata and Colin from 5 years prior, sent 11 days after the fabricated will had been filed with the court. Subject line, handled. Colin's reply, 3 words, confirmed. Stay quiet. Miriam let the words hang on the screen in front of the jury for a long, deliberate moment before she spoke again, and I watched 2 jurors exchange a glance that told me exactly what they now believed. The courtroom went very still. Renata stared at the screen for a long time. When she finally looked up to explain, nothing came out, and her attorney touched her arm. During a short recess before Colin's cross-examination began, I watched him through the small window in the courtroom door, pacing the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood family gatherings, back when he was Just an anxious teenager worried about a test grade rather than a grown man facing the collapse of everything he'd built. For one brief, unwelcome moment, I felt something close to sympathy for him. It didn't last. I thought of Nora's scholarship, of the silver SUV outside our building, of 6 years of my own careful arithmetic at the grocery store, and the sympathy burned off like morning fog. Colin was called the next morning, confident at first, all polish and reasonable tone. Miriam was not interested in his polish. She had the email. She had the financial trail. She had a billing record, obtained through discovery, showing the revoked notary had met personally with C. Vance at an office address in Dallas 2 months before my father's death. She asked, calmly, whether he had ever met with that notary in person. Colin said he didn't recall. She produced the record. Colin started to say that's not, and stopped himself. He asked to confer with counsel. When the recess ended, something in the room had visibly shifted, the way pressure changes before a storm breaks. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. I spent it teaching, because moving through my normal shifts was the only thing keeping me upright. Yolanda called every evening to check in. Priya left soup outside my door the first night, the kind with soft noodles Nora had loved since she was small. Miriam called at 10:15 on the second morning. They're back. I drove to the courthouse with Nora beside me. I told her everything by then, the whole arc of it, from the $50 ticket to Colin's collapse on the stand, waiting until I was certain enough not to hand her false hope. She listened in near silence, and when I finished, she said, "Grandpa wanted us to have it." Not a question, a statement. I nodded, and she nodded back, and that was in its own way enough. We sat in the gallery, Yolanda and Priya flanking Nora, me beside Miriam at the plaintiff's table. Judge Marsh entered, arranged her papers, and the jury foreperson, the retired firefighter, stood and unfolded a single sheet of paper with both hands. Verdict for the plaintiff, on all counts. The fabricated will was ruled void and fraudulent. My father's original will was affirmed as valid and legally controlling. The full estate, $540,000, was legally, unambiguously mine. Additionally, Renata and Colin were ordered to repay the estate over $19 million in unauthorized management fees, plus prejudgment interest, plus the full cost of my legal fees. The judge referred the matter directly to the Travis County District Attorney's Office for review of criminal fraud and forgery charges. Colin said something quietly to his attorney that I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to hear it. His face said everything, the face of a man who had run entirely out of moves. Renata sat very still and did not look at me, and I found in that moment that I didn't particularly need her to. I looked at Nora instead. She had both hands gripped around Priya's arm, eyes bright, and when she caught my eye she pressed her lips together the exact way she does when she's trying not to cry in public, an expression she once informed me she inherited entirely from me. Outside the courthouse, under that flat October light, I stood on the steps for several minutes and called no one. Cars moved on the street below. A woman 2 flights down dropped her coffee and swore at it cheerfully. Nora slipped her hand into mine. "So what do we do now?" she asked. I thought about the house I'd been quietly looking at online for months. A brick craftsman in Washington Park with a big kitchen and east-facing windows where Nora could study. I thought about my classroom, which I had no intention of leaving. I thought about the passport in my drawer with exactly 1 stamp in it. "Whatever we want," I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually believed it. We moved into the Washington Park house that January, Nora and I and a moving truck, and more hope than I'd carried in a decade. The kitchen was bigger than any room I'd lived in as a child, with a window over the sink that caught the morning light exactly right, and I stood there most mornings with my coffee just watching the yard, still faintly astonished that any of it belonged to us. I kept teaching 3 periods a week, because the work still mattered to me in a way money never could, and because I wanted Nora to grow up watching her mother do work that meant something, not simply watching her spend money that had fallen into her lap. I set up a small scholarship fund at my own school that spring, quietly, without my name attached to it, for students who needed exactly the kind of hardship fund help I used to request on Nora's behalf at the front office. It felt like the truest use I could find for any of it. Nora earned her own scholarship that spring entirely on her own merit, no favors required, no golf course phone calls on her behalf, and started at Colorado State that fall studying environmental engineering. In June, we flew to Italy, and I came home with 5 new passport stamps and a phone full of photographs of my daughter laughing in places I never once imagined either of us would stand. Colin lost his license, his firm, and his career entirely. He relocated, and we have not spoken since. Renata lost her home, her savings, and the community she'd spent decades building, and moved in with a cousin outside San Antonio. She had spent 6 years protecting a lie, and in the end it consumed precisely everything she had used it to try to protect. I heard, much later, secondhand, that she told a mutual family friend she wished she had simply told me the truth from the beginning. I don't know if I believe that. Some days I want to. Most days I've simply stopped needing to know either way, and that, more than anything else, feels like the real ending of a story. And me, I have a house, the garden I planted for no reason except that I finally could, Nora's whole future spread open in front of her, a life with room in it to actually breathe. My father had tried, in his own imperfect way, to hand me exactly this. After everything, I finally had it. What did I learn from all of it? That silence, left alone long enough, becomes its own kind of theft. That the people closest to us are not automatically the safest ones. That a spliced signature cannot erase what someone truly meant to leave you. And that the exact moment you stop doubting your own memory is the moment everything else finally starts to change. I think, too, about how easy it would have been to take the 20 million and simply disappear into a quieter, easier version of comfort, and how often, in the months since, I've wondered whether I made the right choice by refusing it. I always land in the same place. It was never really about the number on the check. It was about a father who had, in his own flawed and complicated way, tried to leave his daughter something real, and about refusing to let that final gesture be quietly erased by people who assumed no one would ever look closely enough to catch them. Some fights aren't about money at all, even when the number attached to them has 8 zeros in it. I was a chemistry teacher grading papers on a Thursday night, eating cereal out of the box, when a notification changed the entire shape of my life. I didn't walk away from what came after. I walked straight through it. So here's my honest question for all of you tonight. If you found out someone had quietly stolen years of your life from you, what would you truly do? Thank you so very much for being here with me today. Leave your honest answer in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe right now, because there's a brand new story waiting for you very soon.